to get a better idea of these messages and how something like apocalypticism could creep into and still succeed in a modern show like Death Note, let's go back a bit further. Let's go back to 1945.
Sorry, I probably should be a little clearer here. To say that apocalyptic literature began in Japan in 1945 would be disingenuous. Science fiction with apocalyptic messages were imported to Japan as far back as the beginning of the Meiji period. Before that, apocalyptic rhetoric took the form of highly enclosed communal stories or Buddhist doctrines, and depending on who you talk to, the concept of Mappo is itself highly recollective of apocalyptic literature that would later emerge in the 20th century, and that concept far predates the Meiji period. But our understanding of Japanese apocalypticism, though it can historically trace its roots to before 1945, completely changed after the Second World War. The radical mechanization of death on a scale never seen before, the Holocaust, the Great Tokyo Air Raid, the epistemic dislocation, and not only did the loss of the Japanese effectively destabilize its people from their grand narratives, the means in which it was destabilized was incredibly unique. Everybody's heard of it. Everybody knows about it, and anime remembers it, even today.
I can't stop loving you. I've made up my mind to live in memories of the lonesome time. I can't stop wanting you. It's useless to say, so I'll just live my life in dreams of yesterday.
This is the age of Godzilla. This is the age of hibakusha literature, stories of those who survived the bomb. But I want to stress something. The atomic bomb isn't the only factor. It's just an example of the myriad elements that underline Japanese disaster discourse. There are others, and one particular element that would heavily influence Japan's general disaster fiction is discontinuity. As simply put, the sudden shift. From a sprawling naval empire to a defeated nation, from a top-down hierarchical theocracy to a Western democracy, from feverish nationalist victory to utter defeat. In the wake of Reconstruction and reconceptualization, Japan's 60s and 70s were hallmarked by two major periods that Japanese sociologist Masaji Osawa defined as Riso no Jidai, the age of idealism, and Kyoko no Jidai, the age of fiction. The former was defined by ideas and ideals cropping up or sometimes challenging shift and change, but within the context of the grand narratives being discussed. In this case, the 60s were ideologically charged, something we can find in the riots and political movements. The intent was to change the existing order to something that adherents considered optimal or perfect. Anime and manga never really reflected this age of idealism, so there's little correlation to see. And considering it was in 1963 that anime's first major debut occurred, a few years well into the idealistic age, it wasn't that reflective. And although apocalyptic fiction emerged to complement the age, Inter Ice Age 4 by Kobo Abe and The Last War by Shuei Matsubayashi are notable examples, anime and manga never really kept pace. Now, the idealistic age is broadly considered to have collapsed around the early to mid-70s, with Masaji Osawa attributing the 1972 Asuma Sanzo standoff as a bookend. Between the police and 5 members of the United Red Army, Sasa Atsuyuki attributed the Asuma Sanzo incident as being a huge factor in the decline of the leftist movement in Japan. Alongside that was the decline in the trust of these political ideals that these organizations latched onto, and thus we can find a shift towards a new mode of thought. People no longer cared about changing their systems, they cared about dreaming of new ones. This is the fictional age, the age where answers exist not within extrapolations and idealism, but the imagination. A time where interwoven social senses of release, belonging, community, and well-being didn't exist in political movements or ideologues, but in worlds detached from our own. This is a major age for contemporary Japanese apocalypticism. This was the age of the domestic powerhouse Nihon Chinbotsu. This was the age of Nausicaa Valley of the Wind. This was the age of space battleship Yamato. And most importantly, this was the age of Katsuhiro Otomo's astoundingly influential manga and anime, Akira. In both the manga and anime, Akira begins and ends with the creation of new worlds, but I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself here. Otomo's Akira has the same general plot. An explosion rocks Tokyo, thus birthing the chaotic dystopia that's emerged out of World War III 31 years later, Neo Tokyo. Kaneda and Tetsuo, two members of a biker gang, are out battling a rival gang, the Clowns, when Tetsuo gets into an accident almost hitting Takashi, a boy who is revealed to have telekinetic powers. From there, the events spiral out of control as Calamity uproots Calamity. Tetsuo's telekinetic powers continue to grow to greater heights throughout the series. Kaneda meets a resistance movement fighter named Kei, and over the course of the story, their relationship flourishes. Overall, Neo Tokyo is really beset by problem after problem, and Akira, the source of the initial explosion, is awoken. And if you think that's a little confusing, well, that's the point. Because understanding Akira and its position in the greater apocalyptic text is its nature as a postmodern one. Frederick Jameson notes that two central elements of the postmodern text are what he calls pastiche and schizophrenia. The first Jameson notes is about using other texts as reference. What's important about pastiche isn't just that it's a series of references, but that these references appropriate and meld so many elements together that senses of real and fictional no longer matter. For instance, you can see the clear influence of the bomb in Godzilla, but the bomb isn't the only thing in Akira. There's floods from Nihon Chinbotsu, the militarism of the last war, the number from Tetsujin 28, the influence from Otomo's own previous work, Domu. Schizophrenia, on the other hand, is the lack of temporal continuums in narrative. Jameson argues that linearity isn't something that matters in the postmodern text, and instead each shot, scene, and sequence is presented more as continual presence, where every single thing exists on its own. With dizzying freneticism, Akira jumps from character to character, unfurling its massive narrative with increasing complexity, and yet, at the same time, with little care of any associated temporal interconnectedness. It's not simply a disjointed narrative for the sake of being disjointed, but discontinuity in general. The logical transition is sometimes weak and other times non-existent. So why are these qualifiers of the postmodern text at all important? Why does it matter for the broader study of Japanese apocalypticism? Frida Freyberg argues that a major differentiator of Akira as an apocalyptic text is that Akira is made for a generation of Japanese who have no personal memory of Nagasaki and Hiroshima. So if we can understand contemporary Japanese apocalypticism as starting from 1945, then we also have to understand Akira's primary audience as the first generation completely disengaged from that starting point. In other words, much like Kaneda and Tetsuo, Akira is a work for a generation that never really conceptualized the ground zero of immense catastrophe. And that's really interesting, because I think to understand Akira is to understand early contemporary Japanese psyche. And to understand early contemporary Japanese psyche is to understand Akira. And Akira and postmodern fictional age apocalypticism is defined by discontinuity. In both the anime and the manga, we can find that discontinuity. By drawing upon so many disaster texts, Akira is an encapsulation of uncertainty associated with the collective post-war Japanese psyche. By presenting these texts in a complex space with limited and sometimes non-existent linearity, Akira condenses the history of uncertainty of the culture that created it. In both the manga and the anime, Akira is littered with these symbols. The resistance movement is recollective of the United Red Army. Lady Miyako in the anime is a manifestation of the millenarian movement that emerged from Japan's new religious cults. The empty watery moats that forms Akira's throne is itself a symbolic emblem of the moats of Tokyo, as well as the isolated, total power of the island nation of Japan itself. Akira's position on that same throne is a less than subtle manifestation of the emperor and the history that comes with it. The street demonstrators recall the public protesters of the 1950s and 1960s. The telekinetic children and their association with the military are highly recollective of Japan's growing dependency on nuclear power, something that was introduced to the country in the form of the atom bomb. Akira's burial beneath the Neo-Tokyo Olympic Stadium, itself a carbon copy of the 1964 stadium, is the burial of Japan's destructive past. He is, as Christopher Bolton notes, memory and history, a regrettable military past buried beneath a reconstructed Japan. Akira is, in other words, a symbol of the past that both destroys and saves society, a being with immense power and ability to change the present, but doesn't really. In the manga, residents of the Neo-Tokyo Empire crop up Akira as their god, but it's Tetsuo that really manages things. And while Akira is symbolic of Japan's past, Tetsuo is a manifestation of, at the time of publication, what I believe to be Japan's younger generation, its future. Susan Napier, in her highly influential article on analysis of Akira titled Panic Sites, The Japanese Imagination of Disaster from Godzilla to Akira, notes a critical concept. The Shinjinrui, the generation that came of age in the mid to late 70s, the 20-somethings that never knew conflict, but a peaceful, economically powerful Japan. Napier argues that while Tetsuo's behavior isn't necessarily exemplary of the Japanese youth or the new generation, he does represent an uncertainty and potential inability to address the power given to him. Tetsuo's metamorphosis is a symbolic match to the new generation's slow exercise of their newfound power. The insistent and constant melding between human and inhuman forms is, as Napier notes, terrifying and pathetic, an adolescent unable to cope with the new powers thrust upon him. The identity of Tetsuo as a monster intertwined with Japan's rapid mechanization comes together to show a culturally, economically, and politically powerful state that, regardless, is disconnected and confused. And we can find this supported in the absence of the father figures. Both the Akira manga and anime lacked sufficient father figures, something that Freeberg notes as central given that post-war Japanese society has had to deal with the working father, the absent father. Tetsuo never really confides in any major adult figure in the anime, and given Kaneda and Tetsuo's status as orphans, the movie foregrounds the generational divide by emphasizing its discontinuity. They aren't espousing the ideas of their parents, because they don't have any. The Colonel, while he may be considered a father figure to the children, is more of a representation of authority, broad authority, to Tetsuo. In fact, the only major parental figure we see in Akira is in Lady Miyako, and that's in the manga, whereas the anime version of Lady Miyako turns her into an avatar of Japan's post-war Shinshukyo. The manga approaches her character with a stark and apt duality. On one hand, Miyako, as another telekinetic child, temporarily acts as a stern guiding figure for a shambling Tetsuo, stressing that he needs to get off the pills. This is as close as we get to a real mother figure in both the anime and the manga, and even then, it's not really that sufficient. It's not a current underlying theme. At the same time, Miyako also exists as a vessel for millenarian doctrine, referencing an apocalypse and nevertheless the world that lies beyond the calamity. This conflation of Miyako's character in the manga implies that she is as close to what the work considers an authority figure, and her position as both a vessel for the prophetic end of the world and parental figures implies the role of the Shinshukyo as fillers of spiritual, moral, social, and perhaps at times, familial vacuums. And I think that's really something noteworthy in Akira. Both of them end with Akira's energy intertwined with Tetsuo. And if Tetsuo is a manifestation of confusion that comes from discontinuity, and Akira is the past, then to meld those together is a strikingly reflexive look at its own postmodernism. Remember, Akira emerged during the fictional age, the time where finding answers isn't about changing what existed, but to go to new worlds entirely. Problems solved through escape. Escapism. In the film, Tetsuo merges with Akira into a new universe. In the manga, Kaneda and Kei find meaning in a completely new fictive state. Both solutions are complete detachments from the structures that cause the problem. However, the answers depend on highly symbolic continuities. If Akira is the past and Tetsuo is the generational uncertainty, then the merging of the two is itself a metaphor of bridging the zeitgeist divide. Kaneda and Kei warding off the Americans and the humanitarian groups is itself a dislocation from the wider political system, but they also use the language and general apparatus of Akira's Neo-Tokyo Empire that came before it. And this, I think, is why Akira is so important when it comes to understanding Japan's general disaster discourse. It's not just because it's a widely influential piece, that's certainly a huge factor, but it's also because of how it presents its material, and on a metatextual level, how that presentation of that material has a meaning of its own. It's a summary of movements and ideas in post-war Japan throughout time, emphasizing a postmodern narrative that focuses on discontinuity, a new narrative, a new world, the United Red Army, the sudden growth, the capitalists and socialists, the millenarians and Shinshukyo, the lacking parental figures, the violent past, the atom bomb, all of them existing at the same time, in the same space, a vivid encapsulation of Japan's post-war troubles. And the rebuilding structures of its massive manga betray its reflexivity. A new world isn't just built upon a complete cleansing of order, but structures that already exist. It's not only a hallmark of the fictional age, ending crises by escaping into another world entirely, but also a critical evaluation of it. Just as how Tetsuo is the one that so starkly recalls the postmodern dilemma of identity, it's Kaneda and Kei that provide a potential answer to it. In the manga, Kaneda and Kei driving off into the city of Neo-Tokyo pedestalizes friendship and camaraderie. And that's really interesting, that while older structures may seemingly fail the newer generation, it's in the like-mindedness of the group that we can only see progress. But whether that's something Otomo endorses or whether that's just a suggestion is uncertain. Regardless, as a roadmap of Japanese apocalypticism from the post-war era to the 1980s, Akira summarizes and challenges these shifts. And it's no surprise regarding the wildly popular status it has, both locally and abroad. And I would argue that there's no better time capsule of Japan's movements from 1945 to early 90s than Katsuhiro Otomo's Akira, a story that begins with, funnily enough, the end. A story where Kaneda and Kei stand amidst beams of heavenly light, or where they drive off into a rebuilding city. A story of the fictional age. But I have to stop at the 90s because something happened. Something happened to the fictive escape itself. Something killed it. Next time, we're going to look at how apocalyptic rhetoric merged with the fictional age to bridge the gap between imagination and reality, and how the calamities that follow gave birth to a completely new type of storytelling.